The world is holding its breath while it is burning. Tensions are rising between citizens and authorities, between bodies and cameras, between facts and social media. Freedom of movement is at stake everywhere. The question is, where can we find room for change?
For me, that's one of the key things for the future of protest, is this, what we call the DNA of protest, saying no, and yes, look, this is another way of living.
If you had asked me about the future of protest like a year ago, I would have given a much different answer. What coronavirus effectively does is it erases the possibility of public space, which is so crucial to social movements.
This is Backlight. Welcome to the future of protest. The coronavirus showed us how fast our freedom of movement can be limited. But before we look at the future of protest, we look back to one of the biggest protest movements of the past decade, Occupy Wall Street. The protest movement that became visible worldwide after the financial crisis of 2008. Micah White has been an activist all his life. He was at the cradle of Occupy Wall Street.
I started doing activism when I was 13 years old, and basically every year since then I did some sort of new campaign until when I was 28, I co-created Occupy Wall Street while I worked for a magazine called Adbusters in Canada. When the movement started to really when it really struck me, the magic of it is I was in Berkeley, California, and we were eating at like a diner, and I could hear people at the table next to us talking about Occupy Wall Street. And then it just increased. Everywhere I went, I heard people talking about Occupy Wall Street. And then I started to see Occupy Wall Street graffiti, and then Occupy Wall Street protests, and everything. It just consumed everything. You couldn't escape it. And that was the magic. The thing about Occupy Wall Street is that in many ways, it was the kind of paradigm of what we were trying to achieve as social activists. And so I think that the real lesson that came out of it is that it didn't work. That was the fundamental lesson. And so I wanted to really understand, after Occupy, I wanted to understand why didn't it create the change we wanted.
After the decline of the movement, White retreated to the countryside and wrote a book on the future of various forms of protest. According to Micah White, an important lesson can be learned from the 2003 mass demonstrations against the war in Iraq.
Well, I think that there's a few different explanations for why protests fail. I think that the deeper reason is that the specific strategies that activists are pursuing are ineffective. And the reason why they're ineffective is because they're based on a notion of democracy, a notion of that the right of the government derives from the consent of the people, right? So that if you are a social movement, all you have to do is show mass discontent, and the government has to kind of change its position based on that discontent. And I think that basic idea is what is holding back social movements, because at least since 2003 with the anti-war movement, it's become the norm now that democratic governments actually can safely ignore mass mobilizations.
We gotta stay consistent. We gotta stay consistent. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, you remember how they marched? It wasn't one day, it wasn't 2 days, it was weeks. It was weeks. It was fucking weeks.
Nevertheless, one question is extremely pressing yet again. Can governments simply ignore mass protests? After the death of George Floyd, a wave of protests tore across the world. In Paris, Assa Traoré demands an explanation for the death of her brother.
La mort de George Floyd va imager la mort d'Adama Traoré. Ils sont morts exactement de la même façon. Ils vont porter le poids de ces 3 policiers sur leur corps. Ils vont dire les mêmes mots. Je n'arrive plus à respirer, je n'arrive plus à respirer, je n'arrive plus à respirer. Et quand George Floyd va mourir, je ne sais pas si c'est une coïncidence ou si les choses ont été faites ainsi. Le lendemain, il y a l'expertise d'Adama Traoré qui sort, qui dit qu'Adama Traoré... qui dit que les gendarmes sont exonérés et qu'ils ne sont pas responsables de la mort d'Adama Traoré, qu'Adama Traoré est mort de chaleur. Et là, tout de suite, on se dit, mais c'est pas possible. Avec une très grande spontanéité encore, on va faire une vidéo ce vendredi soir à 20h.
À l'heure où le monde entier autorise tous les rassemblements pour dénoncer le meurtre de George Floyd, le rassemblement est maintenu. Rendez-vous à 19h devant le parvis du tribunal de Paris. Les oppresseurs, ce sont eux. Le peuple sort dans la rue pour dénoncer et demander justice pour Adama, justice pour toutes les victimes.
Et 4 jours après, on sera plus de 100 000 dans la rue.
Nous sommes là aujourd'hui pour dénoncer le racisme en France.
Aujourd'hui, le 2 et le 13 juin sont devenus des dates historiques en France. Quand on a, après les marches, le ministre de l'Intérieur, on a M. Castaner qui va dire oui, la clé d'étranglement, on va voir pour l'interdire. Donc oui, ça marche. Bien évidemment, ça marche. Et qu'est-ce qui nous motive à continuer dans la rue? Si on ne va pas dans la rue, si nos anciens avaient dit ça, aujourd'hui, je ne serais pas là, moi. Assa Traoré, elle ne serait pas là. La femme que je suis, elle ne serait pas là. La femme noire que je suis, je ne serais pas là. Si nos anciens n'étaient pas descendus dans la rue.
La femme que vous voyez là, aujourd'hui, on lui dit merci. Merci à Assa Traoré. C'est grâce à elle, aujourd'hui, qu'on est là. Les quartiers sont dans la rue.
Je ne vais pas utiliser le mot icône. Moi, je suis la sœur d'Adama Traoré. C'est important. C'est important que les gens lui disent Assa Traoré, elle est là parce qu'on a tué son petit frère. Si on ne tue pas mon petit frère, aujourd'hui, vous et moi, on ne se connaît même pas. Mais en tout cas, on se fait entendre. Et ça, c'est important. Ça veut dire qu'avec ces sentiments de révolte, c'est le monde entier qui regarde la France. C'est pas Assa Traoré qui est en Time, en couverture de Time, c'est pas ça qu'il faut voir. C'est qu'on dit le monde entier regarde le comportement répressif et autoritaire de la France. Donc ça marche. Donc oui, il faut continuer à aller dans la rue.
To me, it seems like our police force has been infiltrated by white supremacists who are intentionally killing black people. But which activist movement on the left is talking about infiltrating the police? So it's like, well, obviously they've been infiltrated because we don't want to have power. Okay, so then it gets infiltrated by people who do want to have power, and then lo and behold, they're a bunch of racists and fascists because wanting to have power is key to the fascist ideology. That's why they're doing it, because they want power. They're fascinated with power. They want to hold power. So again, it's like, well, if we want to be the police, then we have to be at least comfortable with having power, and we're not comfortable with that. And this has been a huge debate that was in the left in the 70s. We have, Foucault, the way that Foucault said it is, don't become enamored with power, and they dissuaded the left from wanting power. And I think that was a huge, huge mistake.
Politicians don't mind protest. It kind of flatters them. Gives them a reason. They're there. The people are demanding something from them. Direct action, if you haven't got a well in your village, you don't ask your mayor to build the well for you. In direct action, you say to the mayor, we're going to build it, and we're going to build it, and we're building it, and watch us build the well.
John Jordan has spent his life balancing between art and activism. He lives in France, in ZAD, Zone à Défendre, Zone to Defend, where he and some 40 like-minded collectives have created an autonomous territory.
So right now we're in the forest of Roanne, western France. And if people hadn't disobeyed, this place would have been a runway. They wanted to build a runway like this and a runway like this. And we're right here in the middle of the airport. This would probably be the duty-free with, shelves of perfume, champagne. But it's not. It's a welcome space, the library, and attached to the library is the lighthouse, because they basically wanted to build the control tower of the airport here, and we were like, we don't want a control tower, we want a lighthouse. It's got a siren on the top that could be manipulated by mobile phones, so that if there was an eviction, we could hit the mobile phone and the siren would go off and it would tell the whole zone that the eviction had already started. There was a struggle for 40 years against this infrastructure project. In 2009, that struggle became different because people were invited to come and squat the land. They were invited by the farmers and the people already living here, who said, you cannot defend a territory unless you inhabit it. And the idea is to build life in the way of the airport machine. Life as a kind of barricade. And the slogan was, against the airport and its world. Not just against, the airport, but against everything that it represented. Against this idea that the world is just a resource. We start to develop farms and bakeries and breweries and blacksmiths and carpenter workshops and homes, and people start to build that on this land. In 2012, the government say, okay, we're going to come and build the airport. They set up Operation Caesar. This is like Asterix country. And within 2 days, they destroyed 12 houses, 12 farms. And we said we would come back and build a month later. We'd always said that. 40,000 people turn up, and through the forest, they're passing planks. We start to build, for a weekend, a whole hamlet, in a way to say, look, you can destroy this, but every time we will come back, every time we will come and rebuild. It was really extraordinarily powerful. And the conflict is huge, and 300 people are injured. A few months later, the police leave entirely the zone, and for 6 years, we live without police. Of course, we had conflict. All communities have conflict. But we managed for 6 years to actually self-organize and to show the government that actually you can do that, and they hate that. For those 6 years, a whole laboratory of commoning developed here, all run through assemblies. And in the assemblies, you had farmers working with ecologists, working with punks, working with runaways, retired people. I mean, from the local village, you had everything. And the politicians, for years, when there wasn't the police here, started to say this was a dangerous zone of dangerous eco-terrorists, that it was more dangerous to come here than Mosul in Iraq. And our work was actually to constantly break down that storytelling, because struggles are stories. And so the government decides to have a referendum. We lose the referendum by 5%. The government still says, okay, so now we have the permission. Now it's democracy. We're going to build the airport. And then we say, okay, and we invite people to come and put their sticks, a walking stick, into the ground and make a pledge and say, I'm coming back to get this stick if the government come to build the airport. And 40,000 people came, and 20,000 people put their sticks in the ground. And it was an extraordinary moment of people just making this promise to come back. On the 17th of January 2018, after 40 years of struggle, the government declares that there will not be an airport. But in the same breath, they say there won't be an airport here, but all the illegal people who are squatting the land, so all these bodies, these disobedient bodies who'd created this commons, they must go. Biggest police mobilization of the time since May 68. They came with 4,000 police, tanks, drones, and they destroyed 30 of our houses, 35 of our houses. They injured 200 people, they sent 11,000 tear gas grenades against the very people who'd saved this place. Then they do a kind of ceasefire. The head of the police shows a form and she says, now everyone has to sign this form and be legalized. Big debate in the movement. We decide to hack the form because we'd always said this place should remain a commons. 7 collectives didn't sign, and the police came back and they destroyed those 7 houses, which was really a sign of like, you sign or you die. But we're still here. And I think that's, for me, what I really learned here in the ZAD was how to become the territory. When you become the territory changes you, and you begin to change the territory, and you realize it's this relationship.
John Jordan is a legend. You know, like the way it must have felt, you know, as I was watching the video, imagining what it must feel like to walk up those forest paths and come into this community and to see that basically magical reality that's happening right there. It does have a profound effect, and that's why, you know, there is something to be said for activism that just changes who people are. There's a benefit to creating like temporary autonomous zones and temporary experiences that change the way people think and perceive the world. There's a benefit to that, and we're good at that. But there's also a benefit to just like having power. Being able to say that there's not an airport here because I'm the mayor of this autonomous town and my sovereignty is respected by other sovereign governments because I achieved that as a movement. And that's not outside of our grasp. That's the thing, is that's the lesson of the history of modern revolution. But contemporary activists seem to think that they shouldn't pursue that, or that it's not possible anymore, or whatever. They're very skeptical about that.
Meanwhile, the old forms of protest regarding autonomous choices of living space continue as before. They do have a new dimension though: social media. Everyone films everyone else. Police film demonstrators and vice versa. The media come out in full force, which gives the police an opportunity to turn the event into a real spectacle. Media and protest have each other in a hold.
So the camera has fundamentally changed the nature of protest, because activists started to see that they had a power in creating spectacles that were understandable in a single frame or a short clip. You know, this is why we carry signs and we do these things, and in recent years, you know, we have now the capacity to live stream. You know, I'm just saying, quite frankly, like Facebook's capacity to do live streaming influences the way activists do protesting. So Facebook is changing the way we protest. Now, should it be? Should we follow that train, or should we be doing something else? Or is it just so overdetermined that that we're just pawns in this process? This is the questions that activists need to ask themselves.
Glacier Kwong struggles with exactly this reality. Surveillance, face recognition, and controlled data traffic forces the activists in Hong Kong to find new ways of protest.
My activism started when I was 16. We saw at the time there was a government bill in the legislature of Hong Kong that is a copyright amendment bill, but that was actually hindering a lot of freedom of expression online. So me and some of my colleagues founded the group Keyboard Frontline in order to lobby against the bill. And luckily we were successful. The bill was defeated in the legislature. And since then I've been very interested in internet and freedom of expression related topics, and I devoted myself to those topics and also political issues in Hong Kong. And this is exactly the reason why I'm in exile right now. For my safety, I cannot go back to Hong Kong. Like, once I set foot in Hong Kong, I'll be immediately arrested and detained for sure. In 2019, the Hong Kong government introduced a bill. It's the extradition bill, which allows suspects that infringe Chinese law to be extradited back to China, which became very controversial because that means if you criticize the Chinese government in Hong Kong, you might be subject to this law and can be extradited back to China. That triggered 2 million people to go onto the streets. 2 million people is actually a quarter of Hong Kong's population. Sadly, the government did not reply. They responded with batons, tear gas, and bullets. In Hong Kong, we are very concerned about our identity being exposed because it comes in many folds. First of all, we know that the government hates us. They want us dead, basically. Secondly, we know that the police always hack into people's devices, and no laws are there to stop them. And that happened to my colleagues. His phone was hacked and his conversation on Telegram was being used as evidence in court. Apart from stalking us, like following us on the streets, they will tap our phone, they wiretap our phone, they will go to Facebook or Google and ask for our information that Google and Facebook have. And under the new national security law, Google and Facebook have to give it to them. It's the law, or else they will have to leave the Hong Kong market. We encourage people to be careful of their digital hygiene. For example, I've held workshops by activists and general public in order to tell them, you have to have long passwords for your email accounts. You have to use two-step authentication. You have to log out every time. You have to encrypt your files. And so our data is currently at stake. And in this day and age, we are our data. And that means we are all at stake. We organize a so-called yellow economic circle. Yellow is the color supporting the movement. And so shops that are supporting the movement gets cataloged into an online database in order to support the movement and make sure that people can sustain themselves during the movement. And we formed this kind of milk tea alliance with India, Taiwan, Thailand, and of course Hong Kong. These four places all have milk, like really famous milk tea as their part of their food culture. As youngsters and as like protesters, we see each other facing similar threats from the government or even from Chinese government, and therefore with the aid of internet, we are able to connect and exchange ideas, show support, show solidarity together for the fight of like better society and freedom for ourselves. I would say the ultimate weapon protesters have against surveillance and the technology dystopian view, it's our creativity. There's nothing else. We only have our own brain and our own mind and our own imagination. It's very tough, but I believe we will somehow manage it and things will get better from there.
Arjo Fambala is an artist and the founder of Tools for Action. He creates huge inflatables, vital to the image of the biggest protests of the past decade.
Opblaasbare sculpturen kunnen een soort van tussenlichaam zijn, tussen ons eigen lichaam en die actie. Dus het faciliteert de actie en ze kunnen ook als een soort van stootkussen of je gooit het object naar de politie, die drukt het terug. Dus er begint een soort van onvrijwillig volleybalspel. Binnen een seconde kan je daarmee de straat blokkeren. Maar als je het dus in de lucht gooit, dan verander je de straat in een speeltuin. En je kan meteen ook weer van positie veranderen en ergens anders naartoe gaan. Dus het is veel meer fluïde. Denk maar aan de Hongkong-protesten, be like water. Dus het is nog steeds heel erg belangrijk om plaatsen te bezetten. Maar ik denk dat het mobiele en het digitale aspect en ook het media-aspect nog veel belangrijker geworden is.
To change the world has to be pleasure. You can't have sacrificial forms of protest where you feel dead and you feel that you have to reduce your life. And so I learned that in Reclaim the Streets, where this movement, we were reclaiming the streets from cars to replace it with people, saying the streets were the commons that were being privatized by cars, and we would hold huge street parties, illegal every time. And sometimes people would come with puppets and huge dresses, and you'd have 8,000 people dancing on a motorway, and these dresses would turn up, and under the dresses were people with jackhammers drilling into the tarmac to plant trees. It was about saying, the world we want is the world we need to show in our resistance.
If all we're doing is these kind of like performances for ourselves, then we can do that until the end times. We are doing it until the end times. That's literally what we're doing. We're just doing performances for ourselves as we slide into the end times. Even if the magical vaccines solve everything, we're just going to come up to a world where the climate catastrophe has progressed even beyond where it was before. You know, so I think one of the reasons why people might be at this time more willing to protest is because it's harder to imagine a positive future.
My name is Carola. I've become known as the captain of a refugee rescue vessel last year when I was arrested in the Mediterranean by the Italian government. But actually, I'm an ecologist by training and been visiting to the Antarctic 8 times in the last 9 years. So we know from the past that power structures don't change if we just write friendly letters and ask for changes, because they're vested interests. People who have power don't want to concede their power. So this is why we're using civil disobedience in this protest. This is why people have built over 100 tree houses in this forest, and they're not going to give up on their tree houses just like that. We have built tripod structures, we have built over 400 barricades of all sizes and shapes to defend this forest when the police comes to evict the activists and then make the felling of these trees happen. I think there's always reason to be optimistic because we don't know the future until we are there. If we lose this forest, we will occupy the next forest.
You are not alone! 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 You are not alone!
So it's becoming very, very clear what we stand up against. But I think it's much harder for people to imagine what we stand for, like what could be any positive alternative. And I think that is a huge task for all of us in this forest, but also everywhere in society, to imagine positive futures.
If we're serious about the severity of climate change, then it could be a struggle that requires a united front with elites. It could be a struggle that's so beyond politics that we would need a temporary truce. And that's why I went to the World Economic Forum in Davos to kind of explore that reality.
If you are watching this right now, I hope you won't let the fear of uncertainty take over you. You will allow surveillance because you feel like that makes you feel safer. We are a lesson for you to learn from. Do not buy into those lies. You can only have stability and peace and whatever that is you want only through working by yourself. Nobody else should or can give you that. If they promise you, they must be lying and they're up to no good. And I hope I can go home and I will be sitting at home having my milk tea at home. Yeah.
Every right we have, every right to women, the right for women, people who identify as women to wear trousers, going on strike for using contraception, even the right for children to ride a bicycle, or the right to have a weekend. All these things were once illegal, and people broke the existing laws of the time to have these rights. The key is to turn the resistance into the best opera you've ever seen, and one that works.
J'ai du mal à regarder l'avenir parce qu'on est tellement concentré sur ce qu'on vit tout de suite. En fait, ce qu'on vit tout de suite, ce qu'on est en train de construire tout de suite, c'est pour l'avenir, les années à venir, pour le futur. Donc pour construire le futur de demain, il faut d'abord déjà déconstruire tout ce qui est en train de se faire aujourd'hui.
Paragraphen 16 des Hessischen Waldgesetzes. Sie haben die Besetzung auch nicht selbstständig beendet, sodass die Polizei im Rahmen der Ersatzvornahme mittels Einsatz von Polizeikräften und Technik jetzt sie aus diesem Bereich herauslösen wird. Verhalten Sie sich kooperativ und leisten Sie dabei keinen Widerstand.